Hey everyone, racism isn't just history, it's a reality that has shaped America for generations. And today, we're uncovering one of the darkest, most hidden chapters in American history. This is the story of Black Wall Street, and how it was erased in a single night. In the early 1900s, Tulsa, Oklahoma, was home to one of the most prosperous African American communities in the United States. This thriving enclave, known as Greenwood, was often referred to as Black Wall Street. Located just north of downtown Tulsa, Greenwood was a beacon of African American success, an area where black-owned businesses, schools, and homes flourished in an era when racial segregation was still pervasive throughout the country. Greenwood wasn't just any neighborhood, it was a symbol of what African Americans could achieve in a country that often denied them equal opportunities. In the early 20th century, while many African Americans across the country were still struggling under the weight of Jim Crow laws and violent racism, the people of Greenwood were building wealth, establishing businesses, and carving out a piece of the American dream for themselves. At its peak, Black Wall Street was a self-sustaining community. It boasted over 100 businesses, including banks, hotels, cafes, barbershops, law offices, and even a hospital. The streets of Greenwood were lined with homes owned by African Americans, many of whom had created generational wealth through their businesses. This wasn't just economic success, it was a defiance of the social norms that restricted black people across the nation. In a country where systemic racism tried to stifle their growth, the people of Greenwood pushed back. The success of Black Wall Street was built on the backs of individuals who believed in the power of education, hard work, and community. A.J. Smitherman, the publisher of the Tulsa Star, a black-owned newspaper, was a key figure in helping to promote and protect the interests of the Greenwood community. Smitherman, like many others in the area, understood the importance of economic independence and fought to protect it from external threats. This sense of community and self-reliance made Greenwood a model for other African American communities across the nation. For the residents of Greenwood, their success was not just about wealth, it was about pride. Pride in their ability to build something that had been denied to them elsewhere. The area was thriving not only economically but also culturally. Greenwood was home to many churches, schools, and social clubs that celebrated African American culture and provided a space for people to gather and fight for their rights. However, with success came envy. For years, the white residents of Tulsa watched as the black community thrived, and tensions began to rise. Greenwood's prosperity stood in stark contrast to the widespread poverty and lack of opportunity that many white people in Tulsa faced. And while many white residents of the city may have initially ignored the success of the black community, by the 1920s, that would begin to change. Greenwood's success was a threat to the established racial hierarchy. The wealth of Black Wall Street began to make white Tulsans uneasy. Many believed that black people in Tulsa had become too powerful, too affluent. It wasn't just about wealth, it was about the power that came with that wealth. This growing resentment would eventually turn into violent rage, leading to one of the darkest chapters in American history. As Greenwood prospered, so did the resentment from white supremacists who saw the success of black people as a challenge to their authority and control. This would soon lead to the tragic and violent events that would change the course of history forever. Tensions in Tulsa had been brewing for years, but the events of May 31, 1921, provided the spark that ignited a devastating inferno. It all began with an encounter between two teenagers, Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoeshiner, and Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white elevator operator. On May 30th, Rowland entered the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa to use the elevator, which Page operated. What exactly transpired in that elevator remains unclear, but accounts suggest Rowland may have accidentally stepped on Page's foot or bumped into her. She screamed, and Rowland, frightened of what that meant in the racially charged South, fled the scene. Page never filed charges, but by the next morning, the Tulsa Tribune, a white-owned newspaper, ran an inflammatory article titled, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator." The article, laced with racial hysteria, insinuated that Rowland had attempted to assault Page. Soon, rumors spread through the white community like wildfire. By the evening of May 31, a mob of armed white men gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse, demanding that Rowland be handed over. Inside, a terrified Rowland sat in a jail cell, while outside, the crowd grew larger and angrier. News of the situation reached Greenwood, and fearing a lynching, a group of about 75 black men, many of them World War I veterans, marched to the courthouse to protect Rowland. They were armed, determined not to let another lynching take place in the South. Tensions reached a boiling point when a white man attempted to disarm a black veteran. And in the struggle, a shot rang out. That single gunshot shattered the uneasy balance, setting off a chain of events that would soon spiral into one of the most horrific racial massacres in American history. The night of fire and blood. Within minutes, chaos erupted in the streets of downtown Tulsa. White men, enraged by what they saw as an armed black rebellion, stormed Greenwood. The violence was swift, brutal, and merciless. Mobs of white men, many of them deputized and armed by city officials, descended upon Greenwood with fury. They set fire to black businesses, homes, and churches, looting and destroying everything in their path. The air was thick with smoke as flames devoured the once thriving district. The Mount Zion Baptist Church, a symbol of hope and resilience for the black community, was among the first to be torched. White snipers positioned themselves on rooftops, shooting at black residents attempting to flee. Women and children, desperate to escape the inferno, ran through the streets, only to be gunned down. Black men who tried to defend their homes were either shot on sight or rounded up and taken to makeshift internment camps. The city's law enforcement did nothing to stop the carnage. In fact, some actively participated. The National Guard, called in by state officials, did not intervene to protect Greenwood but instead arrested black residents, blaming them for the violence. As dawn broke on June 1, 1921, Greenwood lay in ruins. Over 35 city blocks had been reduced to ash. An estimated 300 black residents were killed, though the exact number remains unknown. More than 1.200 homes and businesses were destroyed, leaving thousands homeless. Survivors wandered through the smoldering remnants of their once thriving community, searching for loved ones amid the rubble. A city's shame, a nation's silence. In the aftermath, Tulsa's white leadership did little to aid the survivors. Insurance companies refused to compensate black business owners for their losses, citing a riot exemption clause. Instead of rebuilding Greenwood, city officials attempted to seize the land for white development. For decades, the massacre was erased from history books, and survivors were silenced by fear. It wasn't until decades later that America began to acknowledge the atrocities of the Tulsa Race Massacre, recognizing the resilience of those who fought to rebuild in the face of unimaginable loss. But in the charred remains of Black Wall Street, one truth remained. Greenwood had stood as a testament to black success. And its destruction was not an accident. It was a targeted attack against black prosperity and self-determination. As the smoke cleared over Greenwood, the black survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre faced an unimaginable reality. Everything they had built was gone. But their fight was far from over. In the days following the massacre, thousands of black residents were left homeless, many forced into makeshift refugee camps under armed guard. Families who had once lived in beautiful homes now huddled in the ruins of churches and businesses, waiting for assistance that would never come. But the greatest injustice was not just the destruction of Black Wall Street. It was the deliberate effort to deny justice to those who had suffered. The courtroom battle that never was. Within days of the massacre, black Tulsa leaders began organizing, determined to seek justice through legal channels. Survivors, business owners, and community leaders banded together to file lawsuits against the city, law enforcement, and insurance companies. They demanded compensation for their losses, accountability for the crimes committed, and recognition of the mass killing that had taken place. Yet, the legal system that had sworn to uphold justice was rigged against them. The city blamed black residents for their own destruction. Officials called the massacre a riot and claimed that Greenwood residents had incited the violence, absolving the white mob of any wrongdoing. Insurance companies denied claims. Black business owners who had lost everything were told that their policies did not cover riots, leaving them financially devastated. Law enforcement protected the white perpetrators. No arrests were made, no trials were held, and no one was held accountable for the mass killing and destruction. Despite overwhelming evidence, including eyewitness accounts, photographs, and records of white men looting and burning black businesses, not a single member of the white mob was ever prosecuted. The resilience of the Greenwood community. Faced with legal roadblocks, the people of Greenwood refused to give up. Black lawyers, journalists, and activists fought tirelessly, taking their case all the way to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. They demanded justice, reparations, and recognition of the massacre. A.J. Smitherman, the editor of the Tulsa Star, used his newspaper to document the horrors of the massacre and expose the lies being spread by white officials. But his activism made him a target. Fearing for his life, he fled Tulsa. His newspaper burned to the ground. Other leaders, like John Hope Franklin's father, B.C. Franklin, set up makeshift law offices in tents and worked tirelessly to help black survivors rebuild. He filed lawsuits on behalf of victims, arguing that the city had a legal obligation to compensate them. But the courts dismissed nearly every case, siding with white officials who wanted Greenwood erased. A nation that turned its back. The fight for justice extended beyond Tulsa. Black activists, including members of the NAACP, took the case to Washington, demanding a federal investigation. They called on President Warren G. Harding and Congress to intervene. But the U.S. government refused to act, unwilling to challenge the growing power of white supremacist groups in the South. The massacre was quickly buried under a wave of silence. Newspapers stopped reporting on it. The nation moved on, and the black survivors of Greenwood were left to fend for themselves. The legacy of the fight for justice. Though the courts failed them, the people of Greenwood refused to be erased. Against all odds, they rebuilt Black Wall Street, using their own savings, donations from black churches across the country, and sheer determination. They worked day and night to restore their community. By the late 1920s, Greenwood was once again a thriving black business district, though it would never fully regain its former glory. For decades, survivors and their descendants continued the fight for justice, filing lawsuits, demanding reparations, and calling for official recognition of the massacre. It wasn't until 1997, more than 75 years later, that the state of Oklahoma finally launched an official investigation. By then, most of the survivors were gone, and the wounds of history ran deep. But their struggle had not been in vain. The resilience of Greenwood's people became a symbol of black strength, a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable injustice, the fight for justice never truly ends. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 was one of the most violent racial attacks in American history. Yet for decades, it remained a deliberately buried chapter. Schools did not teach it. Newspapers refused to cover it. Survivors were silenced by fear. And those responsible for the destruction of Black Wall Street faced no consequences. But why? The erasure of the massacre was not accidental. It was a calculated effort, driven by white fear, political interests, and a deep-rooted desire to maintain racial hierarchies in America. 1. The silence of white Tulsa. Immediately after the massacre, Tulsa's white leaders launched a cover-up campaign. City officials called it a race riot, not a massacre. This language shift was intentional, by labeling the attack as a riot. The blame was placed on black residents rather than the white mob. It also allowed insurance companies to deny claims, leaving survivors without financial restitution. Evidence was destroyed. Police records, court documents, and reports related to the massacre mysteriously disappeared. Officials never conducted a proper investigation, and white-owned newspapers downplayed or erased their initial reports. White residents refused to speak about it. Many of those who participated in the massacre still lived in Tulsa, holding positions of power. Acknowledging the truth meant admitting their role in one of the worst racial crimes in American history. For white Tulsa, silence was self-preservation. 2. The fear among black survivors. For the black survivors of Greenwood, silence was not a choice, it was survival. Speaking out meant risking death. In the Jim Crow South, white supremacy ruled with an iron fist. Survivors who tried to tell their stories faced intimidation, job loss, and even violence. Many feared for their lives and their children's futures. Trauma silenced generations. Parents and grandparents who had survived the massacre often refused to talk about it with their children. The pain was too great, and they feared retribution. As a result, entire generations of Black Tulsans grew up unaware of what had happened to their own community. 3. The role of the media and education system. For most of the 20th century, American schools ignored or whitewashed the history of racial violence. History books omitted the Tulsa Massacre, while textbooks covered topics like the Civil War and Reconstruction. The massacre was nowhere to be found. Even in Oklahoma, students were not taught about the destruction of Black Wall Street. The media avoided the story. Unlike other major events in U.S. history, the Tulsa Race Massacre received little coverage beyond 1921. The city's white newspapers, including the Tulsa Tribune, which had originally incited the violence, actively suppressed the story. For decades, Tulsa's Black community was left to preserve their history through oral storytelling, passing down fragmented memories to younger generations. But without institutional recognition, those stories remained confined to small circles. 4. The systemic suppression of justice. Beyond media suppression, there were institutional efforts to prevent justice for Greenwood. Lawsuits were dismissed. Survivors and descendants fought for reparations in court, but their cases were thrown out time and time again. Courts ruled that too much time had passed, ignoring the fact that it was the city's own suppression of history that caused the delay. The U.S. government refused to intervene. Despite requests from civil rights activists, no federal action was taken to investigate or compensate victims. The massacre was swept under the rug, as America focused on maintaining its image as a land of opportunity. 5. Greenwood still burns. The Tulsa Race Massacre was not an isolated event. It was part of a much larger system designed to suppress Black prosperity in America. When the flames of Greenwood were finally extinguished, the scars remained, not just in Tulsa, but across the nation. The destruction of Black Wall Street was a warning. Black success would not be tolerated in a white-dominated society. And while Tulsa 1921 may seem like distant history, its legacy is still alive today. Economic suppression, the new Greenwood. The people of Greenwood rebuilt, but systemic racism ensured they would never regain what was stolen. Decades of redlining, discriminatory banking policies, and urban renewal projects displaced Black communities across the country. In the 1950s and 60s, Black neighborhoods in cities like Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles were bulldozed under the guise of progress. Today, the racial wealth gap remains staggering. The median wealth of a Black family in America is 1/10 that of a white family. Black-owned businesses still struggle to receive funding, facing barriers eerily similar to those Greenwood survivors encountered a century ago. Tulsa was just the beginning of a larger pattern: police brutality and racial violence. When Black residents of Greenwood armed themselves to protect one of their own, they were called a threat, a riot, a danger to society. That same narrative persists today. In 2014, Ferguson burned after Michael Brown was shot by police. In 2020, Minneapolis erupted in flames after the murder of George Floyd. Time and time again, Black communities suffer violence, then get blamed for the destruction. History repeats itself, not because we forget, but because we refuse to change. Mass incarceration, the new internment camps. After the massacre, Black survivors weren't just left homeless, they were rounded up, arrested, and blamed for their own suffering. That same cycle continues today. The U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and Black Americans are disproportionately targeted. A Black man is nearly 6 times more likely to be imprisoned than a white man, often for nonviolent offenses. The criminal justice system has become a modern version of racial control, just as it was used against Greenwood survivors in 1921. The fight against erasure. 100 years after the Tulsa Race Massacre, the fight for justice continues. Survivors and their descendants still demand reparations. The scars of Greenwood remain, but so does its spirit. Black Wall Street was never just a place, it was an idea. A vision of Black prosperity, resilience, and self-determination. That vision is still under attack. So the question remains, what will we do with this history? Will we finally confront the systems that made Tulsa possible? Or will we let it happen again? Because until justice is served, Greenwood is still burning.